All right, guys, welcome back to another class. Today's class is going to be on a topic that is very, very important. We're going to be looking in win conditions and figuring out how we can look at risk management as a way to reach these win conditions. This is a topic that kind of came up from all of the different teams that I've been sort of looking at and I've been watching over, and this is something that they still struggle with. So I started thinking that this is actually something that kind of stems farther from just team play, and it's something that a lot of players just in general struggle with. Okay, it might be a slightly confusing at first, considering that you have to kind of weigh the different kind of factors in, but I'm going to try to walk you through the simplest form as possible, so it's going to be pretty easy to grasp at the end. So what we're going to be looking at is first understanding what a win condition is, just what it is and how we can work with it. And after that, we're going to be looking at risk assessment. We're going to be looking at 4 different things that we have to look at with an extra 5th just added in, just to make sure that you guys have a really decent understanding on how you can kind of look at different game states, and then maybe at the beginning of the round, maybe the middle of a round, maybe the end of the round, or maybe regardless of where you are in a game, and use that information to create better choices. After all, you can only create good decisions if you have good reasoning. Last but not least, I'm going to be going with the closing thoughts, which is just basically an example, kind of showcasing how you can use the information that we kind of covered today to create really good plays and close out rounds. As always, I'm going to be mentioning that I am still taking one-on-one students. So the program is pretty simple. You're going to be talking with me. We're going to be coaching you through the entire process. And hopefully, like I've seen normally, you will see an increase in your rank. More often than not, I see big spikes within 3 weeks. So you can kind of look forward to that. So if you have any questions to that, join the Discord, or if you want to just message me and ask about it, feel free to do so as well. So first things first, what is a win condition? Okay, a win condition is sort of a situation or decision that you can make that will lead to a higher probability of winning that round. Okay, when you are playing, normally there's a lot of things that kind of tie into, making better decisions or maybe something that might influence your choices. But normally a win condition is directed by not only a logical decision, but something that is easily backed by what the game says. So for example, when you have a higher eco, you're more likely to win because you have better guns, right? So when you have a higher eco, you're more likely to make riskier plays. You're more than likely to make plays that, won't affect you in the future. But at the same time, when you look at your higher economic power, you might use it in comparison to that of a team that has a lower economy. And because they have lower eco power, they might have to use their lesser guns, maybe Buckies or something like that. Maybe they have to use only pistols, and they might create a riskier play than you in order to equalize that round. For that reason, you might look at that and say, there's no reason for us to give up a lot of guns by playing 1v1s, as we might get caught in the multiple scenarios where we might just have to do a 1v5, might be 1v4. So we might as well stick together. This will allow us to maintain a higher trade count and maintain a win condition where no matter what they do, we'll always stay on top. So this is an example of making sure that we use our stronger economic power and leverage it as a way to win more rounds. So using that, let's talk a little bit about the different forms of win conditions. Okay, there's 4 that we're going to cover, but one that we need to really discuss is something that won't really come up as much in ranked, or something that you shouldn't really think about it as much. If you're in a team, map sides and ranks are a little bit weird. When you're playing with map sides, it's important for you to understand what the strong side of that map is. So for example, if you're playing something like Split, defense is incredibly strong. So knowing full well that you are on the stronger side is going to help you create better decisions, as the opponent needs to create riskier plays to get more out of it. If you play defense, all you can do is just wait back, maybe just react to what the opponent is doing, and you'll be okay. When it comes to ranks itself, I feel like that's something that you shouldn't really be considering in terms of your win conditions, because there might be some situations where, yes, the opponent might have a smurf, or they might have a player that's just stronger mechanically, and that's not something that you should really be thinking about when you're trying to make better plays. So how can you just look at the actual variables that you can control? We're going to be looking at the first one. The first one is kills, and this is just kills within a round. So normally the way you look at it is simply like this. When you have lesser numbers, you have to create riskier plays. You have to do things where you have to try to catch the opponents off guard, or maybe try to make a play that's going to give you more space in return. This is a good way of using your lower numbers to basically equalize those numbers and make them even. At the very least, making sure that you have a better chance of winning. If your numbers are higher, you can make safer plays, making sure that you're more tradable. And last but not least, if the numbers are even, if there's any ults in play, you're more than welcome to use them to get that advantage. So in this example over here, we're going to look at one area over it. Let's kind of walk through it pretty simply. Let's say, for example, it's a 3v3. And what ends up happening is you decide to leave your KJ over. You insert a lurk and your KJ stays back, but they die. What ends up happening is now we have a 3v2. The KJ didn't get anyone, and now you're lower on your numbers. You decide to rotate over, you plant. What should you do? Since your numbers are lower, the only way you're going to win this is by playing a little bit riskier. Now you can say, well, what if you have ultimates or something like that? Well, ultimates are a really good way to sort of even out the fight, but they're not the best way to sort of close out a round. Normally, when you're lower in numbers, you're going to find more success if you identify that you can just play a little bit more risky to get a higher reward. Of course, you can just stay back and just play flash and just trade, but at the end of the day, if the enemy plays it right, they just have to trade, and overall, you're going to cancel each other out until the opponent has one player standing. If you're doing something like maybe, for example, playing post plant and maybe you have lineups, well, now your Omen is playing a 1v3, then the likelihood of you winning that is still going to be low. This is why you want to make a riskier play. Let's say the opponent, for example, got caught off by the KJ in this position. Well, now that the KJ got caught off guard, well, now they're lower in numbers, and now they have to look at what exactly it is that they need to do to make the numbers even. They might hunt the KJ, they might go for a flank, they might split and risk the player that's alone trying to catch multiple players off guard, but riskier plays after all is what's going to give them a better advantage in this position. So this is one example of using kills in a round to create better plays. So the win condition would be to look at what your numbers are and trying to see how you can use that to leverage an advantage. Number 2 is looking at ultimates. We just talked about ultimates in just a moment, but this one's a little bit different. Normally, the way that you should look at it is using maybe, for example, a pre-round checklist. What you can do is just think about, for example, what the economy is, what they have in terms of ultimates, who's alive, what they like to do like in previous rounds, right? Ultimates is a good way of sort of identifying what it is that you could try to do to sort of make sure that you're not losing players early or to avoid losing a fight for free. So a good example of this would be looking at what they have in terms of the power of the ult. So for example, some of them are site-wide ults. So for example, if they have KJ, if they have Breach, you probably don't want to be grouped up together or playing really close to an area where that ult is going to hit you. You probably want to play farther back to make sure that even if they do use it, you can just bait it out and it won't hurt your team as much. Another thing that you can try to do is looking at ultimates that are very easy at winning fights. So for example, Reyna is one that you might look at, but other ones might be something like, for example, Raze ult, right? Raze ult is a really good ult that you could use to just kind of win fights for free and get a lot of space just because of it, right? So when you're looking at those ults, maybe you try to bait it out or play away from its range. So using that idea, let me illustrate my point a little bit further, just so we can see how this is used in play. In this area right here, let's say that we're looking at creating an aggressive play and getting a lot of space towards this area over here by short. We're trying to get a little bit of market. However, we notice that Raze has an ultimate, right? Would it be wise for us to play in these closed areas when we're looking to push into an area where Raze might pop their ult? The answer would probably be not so much. We should not do something like this. This is going to result in us just getting killed, and it's not going to give us a lot of room, because if the race results in getting a couple of kills just because of it, then we just lost this entire play for free just because we didn't pay attention to it. Okay. Other areas you should look at is maybe, for example, using Raze as an example, split. A site is also pretty open. Okay, we talked about Breach. That's another example. You probably wouldn't want to play in these areas. Maybe they have a Brim ult, right? You probably wouldn't want to play in this area over here. You can probably jump peek and bait it out if you want to play around it, and again, bait it and play away from its range. So make sure that you're paying attention to these ultimates and see what you can do to kind of play around them. Some of them are going to be a lot easier to play around than others. So for example, Viper ult is a little bit more difficult to play around. So I would recommend that you kind of play around with your team and kind of make decisions based on that. So for example, if you have an ultimate that can clear out the Viper ult, then maybe you should use that. Whereas if the Viper is doing a really bad job of getting kills or the ultimate is really poorly positioned, maybe you can still push it and maybe you can use that to your advantage, right? So just look at different factors and kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But make sure that you're not playing risks where they don't really need to exist. We don't need to push an area where they have Brim ult. We don't have to push an area where they have Raze ult. We don't have to start peeking areas and 1v1s when Reyna popped her ult, right? These are not necessary. Make sure you're paying attention to that area. Don't take 1v1s when the Jet has knives, as you're gonna start feeding them ults, guns. Okay, let's look on to the next one to keep going. The next one we're going to be looking at is the economy. Now, I mentioned the economy earlier as a good way to kind of determine how we're going to be making these risky plays. The economy is one of those ways to do so. Now, I kind of gave you guys some rules of thumb over here, but I feel like it goes a lot deeper than this. And we're going to just really quickly go over what this is and where the deep areas come in and where the depth of looking at the economy might come in, since some things are not necessarily just so black and white. But for now, let's keep it simple. If you have a higher economy, you probably are going to have better weapons than the opponent. This is just looking at ratios. So we have a higher economy than the opponent. Lower economy is something like us using eco weapons and the like. If we're doing something we have a higher economy than them, we're more likely to be better off just playing together. Stick together, hold hands, and don't risk losing 1v1s and losing weapons to something like a Spectre. After all, if they start upgrading, we're going to start losing more and more fights, and it might snowball. So what I'd suggest is if your team is spreading out, especially when you guys have better weapons, it might result in a loss. After all, it's very easy and very rare for opponents to not get caught off guard, especially by eco weapons. Okay, think of, for example, round 2. Let's say you win pistol. You probably want to stick together instead of spreading out. This is a good way to maintain numbers and a good way to maintain the economy advantage that you've gained. Okay, another way to look at the economic advantages is by looking at what happens when you have a lower economy. So for example, let's talk about a bonus round. In a bonus round, the opponent is going to have a lesser guns, maybe a little bit less utility, right? They want to make sure that they can buy the next round. So one thing that might happen is that they might start creating riskier plays. They might create a trap play. They might decide to push out in this position on Pearl. They might decide to just create a lot of noise and ruckus towards this mid area, right? So make sure that you are playing and you're basically looking at these areas and you're removing the reaction aspect of playing with eco weapons, as you're pretty much just acting off of maybe, for example, noise, and always making sure that you're having the advantage. It's a more proactive way of keeping the ball in your court. And this is a great way of keeping the opponent on guard and making sure that they're, maybe, for example, they might become a little bit weaker. They might waver. Okay. So when you have a lower economy, you have lower guns, make sure that you set up trap plays. Make sure you're setting up plays that they're going to fall into. You can create stack plays. You can start gambling into sites, right? Maybe putting more players into an area that you don't need to in normal rounds, right? This is a good way of using the economy as a good way to maintain an advantage. So this is where I was talking about where the depth kind of comes in. What happens if everybody can buy, but you have a little bit more money? When you have a little bit more money, you can start creating riskier plays when it comes to your buying power or when it comes to what you can do in regards to your play. So for example, you can create a riskier play similar to that of an eco round, but with actual weapons, simply because you can afford to lose those weapons. Another thing you can do is afford even more expensive weapons and create plays around it. So for example, on Ascent, you might look into buying an Odin or an Op. These are ways that you can leverage your economy to create easier fights. They're still risky, but the management of you being able to get that money back simply because you have enough money for it is a good way to look at it. Think of it as a trade-off in this position. Okay, so this is another win condition that you can use the economy to your advantage. Make sure that you're paying attention at the beginning of the round. Hey, we have better money than they do. They're on eco. Pay attention to this. Stick together, right? You can kind of give your team an idea of what's going on in the first 10, 15 seconds, and then just kind of let them kind of plan something around that. And then you can kind of go off of that. This is a good way to look at this and sort of don't make that mistake. Like, for example, in this position over here, let's say we have better money than the opponent. Should we be splitting off? Probably not. In this example, this is a really common mistake that I see, especially where people are just trying to get their own kills and they're trying to make their own space and they don't want to stick together. And we end up seeing situations like these on Pearl where the opponents just tend to split off and they do their own thing and we end up losing weapons really, really quickly. Okay, so make sure you don't fall for this plan. Make sure you're not falling for this risk. The last one that I'm going to be talking about is planting. Planting is not necessarily a risk on its own, but it's necessarily how we tend to plant that might create a risk for your team. So let's use this example right here to sort of illustrate what we're going to be talking about. The rule of thumb is if you can plant a little bit more open for your team, regardless of where they are in position, regardless of where they're going to be in post-plant positions, you should be okay. Planting open is always going to be fine. If it's kind of secluded in these areas like these corners and it's only benefiting one half of the area, one half of the site, then you're probably not going to be okay. Planting as open as possible is going to be a great way of guaranteeing rounds. So in this position, for example, we're looking at a team that, for example, we're playing towards B and the lurk went towards A. And maybe the plan was that the late lurk is going to be planting, right? Don't mind the play. This is just don't think too much about the details. Okay. What ends up happening is these guys are going to be coming in. And what most players tend to do is that I'm playing alone. I want to be safe. They plant towards the default. And by the time that these players get here, maybe the KJ dies. Maybe the KJ pushes up and doesn't get any space. But by the time that these guys get here, they are now at a disadvantage because the plant is not in their position. Maybe they need to go all the way around and that wastes more time. So you want to make sure that you're not falling for this. The only time that you should be planting in these super safe spots is if you have post-plant utility, mollies, lineups, you name it, or you have a clear sightline. Multiple players are playing towards the sightline. Other things you can look at is maybe, for example, there's something you can use to your advantage. So for example, in this area over here, you can use an Odin to very easily clear this area. If someone's playing tree and they're using an Odin, maybe you can use that to your advantage. But after all, that's kind of niche. So I would suggest that you try to plant more open than anything. Okay. Pay close attention to where you plant. And in this position, the KJ could make the mistake of planting here as their team is kind of coming back to regroup, or they can plant open so it can be a little bit easier for them to come in and help. Okay. Make sure you're planting according to what your team needs. But as always, the more open the plant, the safer it's going to be for your post plant. You'll always be okay in planting open in these situations overall in most rounds in general. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about using this to our advantage. So over here, we're going to be looking at a round that I played. Don't think too much about the details, but I do want to show what it is that you can do to sort of use these win conditions. We're going to be using the 4 different things that we talked about, and we're going to see how this works. So over here, we're going to be looking at a play where we decide to kind of start playing towards this area. We got to pick towards this area over here by tree, meaning that we're now higher in numbers. What we realized is that they all made a huge amount of noise into this position over here by tree. So we realized that a lot of them already rotated off. So what we're thinking is because there's so many players over here, there's really no point in them kind of pushing onto us because again, they need to start making more risks. So what we started thinking instead is let's move back and kind of start taking, I believe, B. So what we're going to be doing over here is you see me kind of moving in and everybody's like thinking, no, rotate off, let's move over. Okay. What's going to end up happening is maybe you'll be paying close attention to your utility like I was, and you won't be seeing what's going on into the other areas of the map. But you'll see that our decision to stick together slowly crumbles and falls apart. You're going to see that players start kind of veering off. And even though we planted a lurk and we decide to play safer and rotate and group together, you're going to see that this grouping together doesn't necessarily last very long. We lose players very, very quickly as we start kind of losing the lurk that we planted, and then another player tries to trade that and that doesn't work. But now the numbers are even. Despite the fact that we had more numbers, we decided to split off, and this is where risks start happening. Risks didn't need to occur here. We could have kept a higher number count, but we chose not to do that. Okay. So what ended up happening is now we're at the even stage. We don't really know what to do. Jet could use ults or something like that, but you're going to notice one thing. And this is one thing that I need you guys to keep in mind. Despite the fact that we have even numbers, only 2 of us are together. So if they decided to come all into CT, despite the fact that we saw somebody tree here, if they all decided to come CT, we're actually going to lose because it's a 3v2. Despite the fact that our Jet is alive, Jet is too far away to trade us. So they're probably going to retaking. So what I end up doing is I tend to use here the little plant strategy. I plant open despite the fact that we could just play backside. And I start looking at the fact that we are missing numbers. Jet is not going to be meeting us over here by main. So I decide to look at this as a 2v3. This is where I look at what's going to be making us a little bit safer in the win, and I decide to make a riskier play. You could say, well, this risk over here shouldn't have happened. Maybe both you and the KJ can hold off until the Jet can get here, right? And that is possible. You could potentially do that. But after all, this is still technically a 2v3. They basically lose a player really early over here by mid. Jet decides to kind of break off. They decide to ult. And at this position, what you could do is either A, look at this as a way to kind of retreat. But in this position, I decided to kind of push in forward and make that risky play as I was already planning on doing, which resulted in me getting 2 kills. And then the Clove just ulted and, died off on their own. So basically, to look at the details, we used numbers to our advantage as a way to create plays to stick together and rotate together. We decided to also make risks that weren't important. So for example, we didn't use our numbers to our advantage, which ended up us equalizing the round for them. And then after that, we decided to, plant open, which allowed the team to be able to play around that. And last but not least, after that, we were able to use, since we were separated, the plan of playing a little bit riskier to win the round for the team. Okay. There's a couple things you could do, but for example, you can decide to use this 3v2 example after that happened and play safe. After all, that would have worked if the Jet got a pick. Sorry, if the Jet didn't get a pick here, then it probably would have still been safer to just for us to go for a riskier play. But it doesn't really matter too much at the end of the day. After all, we're not going to overthink a ranked game as some things are just better off left as they happen. Okay, with that out of the way, that pretty much concludes what today is about. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or just ask them after this class. We're going to be closing this off. Thank you guys for watching.